Hello and welcome to the iTnews podcast, brought to you by Fortinet and the 2024 State of Security Report. I'm Ray Crozier, Editor-in-Chief of iTnews. Stay tuned until the end as we dive into how Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, can streamline network security, cut costs, and enhance protection by consolidating multiple tools. Fortinet's Robert Nobilo outlines the key steps to kickstart your SASE journey. But first, ANZ Banking Group's Chief Information Security Officer, Dr. Maria Milosavljevic, walks us through the bank's current security strategy, with a focus on embedding security, building resilience, and enabling business transformation. You've been in the CISO role at ANZ now for a bit over a year. Can you just talk through what that first year has looked like from your perspective?
Absolutely. There's been a few things that I've prioritised this year. Obviously, the first thing is just to get to know ANZ and also to understand what it's like to be on this side of the regulatory relationship, and that's been really quite interesting. A second thing would be implementing our strategy. It was approved in my very first week in the role, and so that's been a big focus for us to uplift. Then a third thing is ANZ is very solid when it comes to security, but we do want to be a global leader in this space. And so a lot of my time has been spent on assessing our current state as well as thinking about what that vision should be for the future, what it means to be a global leader in this space, being a global bank. And then as part of that, really looking at the type of leadership that we need to have across the bank. And really, given the nature of security, we are dealing with something that is no longer something that a single business unit can drive. It is really something that has to be systemic across the entire organisation, and that requires a very different type of leadership. It requires people who are very adaptive, who are very creative, who can be very connected and collaborative across an organisation and with all organisations and peers outside the bank. And so a big part of that has also been understanding current accountability and redefining what that needs to look like in the future. So how do we really move to a much more shared or mutual responsibility approach to this? And not just within the bank, but also with our relationships with organisations such as third-party providers, regulators, peer organisations, etc. And so both outside the organisation and then inside the organisation, all the different parts of the organisation understand what their roles are and getting that intersection working extremely well. A lot of this has been focused on exercising so that people can experience what it's like to actually go through a significant cyber event and then understand what their roles are in that and where the gaps are, because you don't know what you don't know until suddenly you're faced with the reality of something you never expected, and you don't want to be trying to work out all the details then. And then the fifth priority that I've had is to really understand, and again, it's part of that being a global leader, we've got to be able to be smart and fast. So how do we make sure that we can experiment at pace, that we can put effective guardrails for things like AI in place, but not slow things down? You don't want security to be the department of no. You want security to say, yes, you can do this if you put these kinds of controls in place. Then personally, it's been a very interesting year. I was actually diagnosed with a condition called cervical dystonia just before I started the role. It basically is like a disproportionate muscle tone in my neck. And yeah, really weird. And so the treatment for that is typically Botox in the muscles in your neck. And I reacted very badly to the Botox. And unfortunately, with something like Botox, you have to wait for it to stop working, and there's not a lot that you can do. And so I was brand new in the bank. I'd only been in the role for a couple of months when I had this treatment, and then I had to deal with some pretty significant complications. And so it was very challenging personally because I live near Canberra. I do a lot of travel between Canberra and Melbourne, and also couldn't go and see my staff overseas, which I've now finally managed to do, which is great. But I learned a lot about vulnerability and really trusting your team and enabling and empowering people and focusing one day at a time and using all my CISO skills in a personal capacity. So it's been really quite an interesting year.
Wow, that is crazy. And that is a huge amount to unpack. I don't know if I can begin to unpack that. Just one thing I wanted to pick up on was you mentioned that you implemented your strategy and you had that approved within the first week of being there. So you really hit the ground running. Can you just talk through what that looked like?
Thankfully, to my predecessor, Lynn, when she did the hard work of actually building out the new strategy before I started, she did a great job of driving all of that, and my team, obviously, as well. And so in my first week, it was approved by the board. There are 3 pillars in the strategy. The first one is around embedding security across the bank. I just talked about some of the things that have been our priorities, including this, which is really making sure that everyone understands what their roles and responsibilities are, making sure that security as a risk culture is something that is truly embedded. It's not just something that we talk about. It's actually something that is really very much within our DNA. And so a lot of that has been a lot of conversations, a lot of bringing some clarity, understanding the roles people play. The exercises that I said have really helped to bring that to light. As I said, if you're faced with something that you've never really anticipated before, you're suddenly required to think very carefully about, hang on, who actually makes these types of decisions if they've never been made before, and who is authorised to make those decisions, and even things like what does the board do versus what does management do, and where do you draw those lines, and how do the different parties actually interact. Cybersecurity is increasingly complex and more sophisticated. The nature of the threat actors has definitely changed, so we've got to constantly adapt to that. And we've got to come up with scenarios that are realistic that we can take the bank through to say, okay, so if this happens, then how will we respond to that? Who's playing what role? What kinds of decisions do we need to make? And how do we do that? And because it's not just the bank and all the parties within the bank, it's also all of our third parties, it's our regulators, it's lots of these external relationships, it's our shareholders and other stakeholders, and who's doing what, who's communicating what to who, when, how does it all come together in a much more simplified way? So that's been a big focus for us. And as I said, it's one of the core pillars of the strategy. Another one is around strengthening resilience to emerging threats. The resilience is also that broader, how does the whole organisation make sure that we can work as one team in these types of attacks, but also looking at things like third parties. How do we work more effectively with third parties? We are in a very different world to what we were 10 years ago. We take a cloud approach to things. How do we make sure that when we enter into new relationships with third parties, we're very clear about what our expectations are? But just like with the exercises, you don't know what you don't know until suddenly it faces you. And so the way that we negotiate, the way that we set those relationships up, there's contractual arrangements, but then there's also the soft relationships, the trust building, the working together on a daily basis. The third one is about enabling business transformation. And this goes to the priority I talked about before around being fast. We don't want to be that department of no. We really do want to be able to make it easy for people to comply. So we've spent quite a lot of time developing what we call an experiments at pace framework. There's like a green path where it's almost like a snakes and ladders. You want to avoid all the snakes, but find all the ladders, right? So where's the ladder to take me from here and fast track me through to where I want to get to? And I don't want to suddenly bump into a snake and end up all the way back down to the start of the whole process. So we've built a process for that to really help different parts of the organisation to self-help so that they can navigate this themselves until they go, no, this is a bit more complicated. I've got a use case where it's not actually straightforward and I need a bit of help. So a lot of our time has been on that, as well as things like designing our systems so that they are secure by default, not just by design, but by default as well. We're in the middle of rolling out a zero trust framework, more network segmentation and isolation, better encryption of our data, making sure that, especially with third parties, the data is managed really effectively, etc. So a lot of work in that space.
It sounds like from what you're describing that even though much of the strategy was prepared once you came into the organization, you've really been able to put your stamp on it in terms of the way that strategy is implemented and executed within the broader ANZ group.
Yeah, and particularly around the resilience and the embedding, I think that shared accountability model and really defining accountability, making sure it's very clear for people and not allowing all the grey to be there. There's this great saying, which is, if in a crisis you're swapping business cards with people, you've lost the battle. And it's exactly the same with cybersecurity. If you're suddenly having to work out who's who in the middle of a crisis, it's not a good situation to find yourself in.
Just on that, how have you approached the exercising that you mentioned as one of the priorities, and that also flows into the strategy as well? How have you approached the design of those exercises and the implementation of them as well? I'm guessing your background would help in terms of defining some of these exercises as well.
Absolutely. And obviously, it's not just me. We've got an amazing bunch of people, I have to say. I'm so fortunate to have inherited the team that Linwen created. The way we've done this is to really focus on a range of different angles. We did our first enterprise-wide exercise in November last year. That was mammoth. We had everyone from people on the ground doing normal day-to-day IT all the way up through to the board involved in that. Now, of course, you can't involve everyone across the whole organisation, so it had to be focused on key roles and decision makers and action implementers. What we did was we took a scenario that was based on what had happened to another organisation, which is a pretty significant incident, and it was something that they really struggled with. We took ourselves through a real scenario and really pressed into some of the more difficult decisions that would have to be taken, and then looked in the mirror to see whether we thought that we were ready to execute on some of the things that we needed to do. And so based on that, we then identified where we needed to uplift, and we're well progressed in terms of that. That was the whole of organisation. But we're also doing a lot of smaller exercises, such as specific divisions, so specific parts of the bank, exercising particular things. Some of the things that we're planning to do in the future is looking at specific cross-functional areas. For example, how the Australian side of the organisation works with New Zealand. If there's an incident that happens in New Zealand or in the Pacific, how do we work side by side? Obviously, with the Suncorp Bank acquisition as well, we've done some exercising there. We've got different phases through that process, and over time we'll just exercise how the nature of the relationship shifts and make sure that we understand if something happens, who's actually doing what and who's holding the baton, so to speak, and when does the baton get handed from one party to the other? What does that handoff look like? Do we have the right kinds of documentation in place, etc.? A lot of my focus personally is making sure we've got absolute clarity on what is the process. Have we documented it well? Are there gaps in that? Are we facing into things that we haven't thought about? And let's make sure we document them. Making sure people are very clear on their roles and responsibilities, especially for decision making. And does decision making look different in a crisis? Because you don't have the luxury of time. Something I've done in the past, when I established cybersecurity in New South Wales, I put in place the cyber crisis arrangements for New South Wales. It's on the emergency management website for New South Wales still. In those arrangements, what we did was I created an entirely different architecture for decision making for a crisis. People actually had completely different hats or titles. And with those titles, which were authorised under an act of law, they then had additional latitude to make decisions that they wouldn't normally be authorised to make alone. It's the same kinds of things in the private sector. In a crisis like that, who gets to make a decision more quickly? You can't necessarily pull together a committee for things. That clarity on accountability is absolutely critical to exercise so that everyone knows going into something. And then another part of it is exercising scenarios where you are saying the CIO is overseas or the CISO is overseas, or some people are on a plane flying from country to country and they're actually not available. And so who steps up into those roles? Also, if you have to go from a business as usual scenario to a 24/7 scenario, how do we quickly activate people so that we've got the right kinds of people sleeping at the right times and going into a 24/7 type of operation? So there's an awful lot that every organisation really needs to do, and we're on our way in terms of understanding exactly how we respond should the worst happen.
Something you mentioned at the top of that section was about the team and the support of the team that you have. It might be an opportune time to talk a little bit about how security is resourced at the bank and what it looks like across the bank. Obviously, that sort of blends into one of the specific strategic pillars, which you mentioned, which was around embedding security across the organization. I'm assuming there's some relationship there in terms of how capabilities are structured and distributed.
Yeah, exactly right. So we have teams distributed across Australia, and then we have global teams as well. So I've got quite a lot of staff in India and in Manila. We also have the New Zealand part of the bank, and there's a whole security team there that operate within the New Zealand division. So with India and the Philippines, a lot of the reason for doing this is scale. We want to be able to make sure that we've got access to the right kinds of resourcing in the right places and the right skills, but also being able to work in a 24/7 manner. So our 24/7 SOC is based in Manila, and we've got an amazing team there that we have had in place. In fact, we're celebrating their 10-year anniversary, which is amazing. So we look at where we can get the best skills possible. And then within Australia, we've got most of our people in security are in Melbourne, but we do have people elsewhere across the organisation. Now, that's the security domain, but there are people working in security across the bank in many different areas. And there are people who work in risk, for example, which has a very large intersection with what we do. So we've got this very distributed nature of security, and everyone ultimately plays a role, but some people play a more important or significant role than others.
You mentioned security by default, zero trust and encryption and other things. It'd be useful to understand how you think about technology and technical-based capability and how you decide what to bring into the organization.
First of all, we don't procure technology just because it looks good. We very much drive the conversation. And the way that we drive that conversation is really through a risk lens. What do we think is happening in the external environment? And so we've got a very good strategic and operational threat intelligence capability. What do we think is happening, and how is that changing, and how is that likely to change? What does that mean in terms of our exposure, our vulnerabilities? And so where do we then need to prioritize? So that's the first thing, is where do we think we actually need to prioritize? Ultimately, we take a very proactive approach, anticipate what may happen, and then where do we need to focus our attention? So we then look for what we think will assist us in addressing those risks. You've mentioned some of the things that we're looking at. We're partway through a zero trust implementation. A lot of that is focused on things like stronger authentication, much stronger network controls, better segmentation, also data-driven protection, so that we can see more what is actually happening, both in terms of our risks as well as behaviour across our network. And then, as I said, really that segmentation, isolation. If someone did get into the systems, how do we make sure that we can, number one, detect it really quickly, but number two, limit their ability to traverse the network? So a lot of our focus is within that zero trust. And of course, that's like many other organisations as well. A lot of them are looking at this as well. We've spent quite a bit of time thinking about AI and machine learning and how we can leverage that. We have done quite a lot in this space already. Our Security Operations Centre has automated a lot of the more tactical, mundane work, which means that we can focus our attention of our staff on much more strategic pieces or more difficult pieces that really require a human being to be thinking through. We also work with a lot of existing partners on how we can leverage better technologies that they are creating, or even work with them to test out new ideas, think about new opportunities that can be brought to bear, where we could automate things, etc. Things like policy, for example, and obviously this is not necessarily a technical thing, but we are looking a lot more and have done a lot of work on automating the control environment, making sure that we reduce as much of the manual overhead on testing our controls and getting that situational awareness in a 24/7 capacity so that we understand what our level of risk is or what our posture is at any point in time.
And I'm assuming policy and controls form a basis of some of the work you mentioned around experiment at pace as well, in terms of the guardrails that you're putting in place around
Correct.
that innovation.
Exactly right, yes.
Perfect. Now, I do want to ask you, what would you say is the most impactful thing that the bank has done from a security perspective in the past year?
That's a tough question. We've done a lot in the last year, particularly in alignment with that strategy that I talked about before. That work I just mentioned around our control environment has been a massive effort for us, huge uplift. When you're going from manual to automation, there's a lot of data work that has to be done to make sure that can happen. The experimental framework that I mentioned as well, that's been a fantastic achievement for us. And obviously the zero trust work and the strategic intel piece that I mentioned. But if I was going to pick one, I would say that it's the work of our Security Operations Centre. They are ultimately the teams that protect us every single day. They're at the coalface. They're always looking proactively for what's actually going on in our environment. And the work that they do is what allows me to sleep at night because they are really on the ball. And so I appreciate the work that they do. I think the uplift that they have put in place, not just the last year, but a few years, is quite extraordinary. We ingest 13 billion data events every single day. So automation is not something that we actually have a choice about. It is something that is absolutely critical. They've really pressed into this and managed to do an extraordinary amount of work, which I'm very proud of them for.
Awesome. Just on the controls testing side of things you mentioned and moving from manual to automation, I assume that an element of that is that you're able to test more frequently or across a broader
Ongoing.
spectrum of applications.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly right. It means you're not just doing it on a monthly or a quarterly basis or weekly or depending on the level of control, but actually it's something that can be there sitting in the background permanently.
Was there anything else you wanted to get across or you think we missed?
The one last thing I'd do is say, for people who are out there who want a career in cybersecurity, please do. We have many gaps, not just within ANZ, but across the whole sector. People who have traditionally worked in other areas and not necessarily technology, but any technology areas as well as risk and other areas, please consider security. We need you.
With over 3,000 security tools in the market and enterprises using dozens of security solutions to counter threats and risks, managing different tools is an immense challenge for data security teams. Robert Nubilo, Solutions Lead for Secure Networking at Fortinet, says deploying, managing and monitoring so many tools means security teams need to take a different approach.
The main challenge is complexity. When you've got so many different security tools, it's harder and harder to manage them, patch them, tune them, water them, etc. So trying to integrate them all together, they're not really integrated effectively. The other issue that we're facing is there is a skill shortage. So trying to find the resources who can actually manage all these disparate tools. And that's what's leading customers more towards a consolidation approach. So trying to consolidate as many of those vendors as they can into a single platform.
Integration is often touted as the answer to these challenges, but that's not as easy as it sounds.
The main challenges that poses is that most of those integrations aren't really native integrations. So they're really stitching together things, trying to use a central repository to do any types of automation in there. So I think the main driver here, once again, comes back to a platform approach, finding a vendor that has a single operating system that can actually integrate all their products and stitch them together into one single platform approach.
A response to this complexity is to use AI. Robert says that while AI can be a powerful tool, it can introduce other complications.
AI and ML can help, but there are also challenges that we're facing as we start rolling out these AI models. It comes down to the information actually given to the AI and the LLMs. So making sure that the right data is going in there, the right contextual data can can definitely help, but as I said, it does create challenges because it's only as good as the information that it receives. The issue we're currently facing with AI is we definitely don't have the people and the resources available to feed the information in. AI is only good as the information that you're putting into the machine learning, into the large language models. So finding the right resources to populate that, to actually enrich the AI is definitely one of the biggest challenges that we're facing at the moment.
With the spread of tools and data adding to the burden of under-resourced and overworked security teams, a different approach is needed. Robert says SASE can help consolidate security applications and data to reduce the stress on security teams.
SASE helps consolidate and converge our networking and security. So as time has progressed, we've got our hybrid workforces now. We've got hybrid applications that can be on-premise, they can be in the cloud. Workers are everywhere. So it's trying to find that consistent security model there. So from a consolidation perspective, being able to consolidate 5 to 10 tools into a single platform approach is definitely helping with the issues around skills and resource shortages, but also ensuring that we have not only consistent security, but a better user experience for the users, no matter where the users are, no matter where the applications are.
For many organisations, identifying the need to change approach is the easy part. Robert says there are 3 key steps organisations need to take to start the journey towards SASE and platform consolidation.
If you look at the 3 things that you probably need to have a look at first is your renewal schedules. Because we are replacing so many vendors within your environment, or potentially replacing so many different tools within your environment, looking at when your renewal schedules are up, looking at your top priority projects. So is it WAN optimization? Is it ZTNA? Are you looking at secure internet access? And the third comes down to a resourcing perspective. It's all well and good to go down the SASE path, but if you don't have the resources or the project plans in place to actually roll a SASE out, you're not going to have a very good deployment, and it's going to make it very hard to achieve the outcome that you're trying to achieve.
SASE provides a way to reduce the sprawl of security tools. With organisations looking for ways to better use scarce resources, SASE simplifies and enhances network security while reducing costs and ensuring consistent policies across the entire security stack.
That's it for this fortnight's episode. Please let us know what you think by reviewing the IT News podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts from. Your feedback is greatly appreciated and helps us create content dedicated to you, our listeners. And for all the latest headlines and happenings in Australian technology news and all the latest trends from our State of Security report, visit itnews.com.au.